Within the mythology of Star Wars, few concepts are as widely accepted and as rarely questioned as the idea that the dark side of the Force is inherently evil. From the fall of Anakin Skywalker to the rise of Darth Sidious, the narrative consistently presents the dark side as a corrupting influence, one that twists, consumes, and ultimately destroys those who embrace it. It is associated with anger, hatred, domination, and suffering. In contrast, the light side is framed as harmony, balance, and selflessness. But what if this interpretation, while compelling, is also incomplete? What if the dark side itself is not evil in essence, but rather a natural aspect of the Force, misunderstood and misused by those who attempt to wield it beyond their limits? This perspective invites us to reconsider a foundational assumption: that the true danger does not lie in the dark side itself, but in the intent and ambition of those who seek to dominate it. Throughout Star Wars legends, we encounter individuals who do not merely draw upon the Force. They attempt to consume it, to bend it entirely to their will, to access what can only be described as limitless reservoirs of energy far beyond what finite beings are meant to channel. Figures such as Darth Vitiate, who devoured entire worlds, or Darth Nihilus, who became a void of endless hunger, do not simply use the dark side. They distort the Force itself. And it is in this distinction that a deeper question emerges. Are these individuals evil because of the dark side? Or does their pursuit of limitless power transform them into something unnatural, something destructive, regardless of the aspect of the Force they draw from? If the Force is, at its core, a balance, an interconnected energy field binding all life, then attempting to seize it entirely, to override its natural flow, may itself be the true violation. Not darkness, but imbalance. In this analysis, we will explore whether the dark side is inherently evil, or whether it is the misuse, overreach, and distortion of the Force, driven by mortal limitations and unchecked ambition, that gives rise to the destruction we associate with it. To properly examine this alternative perspective, we must first establish the mainstream depiction of the dark side within Star Wars. Traditionally, the dark side is presented as the corruptive half of the Force, a path defined by negative emotions such as anger, fear, hatred, and aggression. It is often described not merely as a tool, but as a temptation, something that draws individuals in with the promise of power, only to gradually erode their morality, identity, and ultimately their humanity. This view is reinforced repeatedly throughout the saga. The Jedi teach that the dark side is quick and seductive. It offers immediate results, but at great cost. Those who rely on it are said to become consumed by their passions, losing control as their connection to the Force becomes increasingly distorted. Figures such as Anakin Skywalker embody this narrative. His fall is not depicted as a rational philosophical shift, but as a tragic descent, driven by fear of loss, manipulated by Darth Sidious, and ultimately culminating in his transformation into Darth Vader. Similarly, Sith ideology itself reinforces this perception. The Sith code emphasizes passion, power, and the breaking of chains, encouraging the individual to draw strength from intense emotion and to impose their will upon the Force. In doing so, it rejects restraint, balance, and harmony in favor of domination and control. From this perspective, the dark side is not neutral. It is inherently destabilizing. It corrupts the user because it is rooted in imbalance, favoring excess, intensity, and control over equilibrium. The more one relies on it, the more one becomes dependent on it, leading to a cycle of escalation where greater power demands greater emotional extremes. This is why so many dark side users exhibit similar traits: physical degradation, emotional volatility, obsession with power, a tendency toward domination and destruction. Even in legends where the lore becomes more expansive and nuanced, this portrayal largely remains intact. Sith lords such as Darth Sidious and Darth Vitiate are not merely powerful, they are depicted as embodiments of corruption, their actions bringing widespread suffering on a galactic scale. Thus, the mainstream conclusion appears straightforward. The dark side is evil, because it leads to evil outcomes. However, this raises an important question. Is the dark side itself the cause of that corruption? Or is it the manner in which it is used? Because when we look closer, a pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests the true issue may not lie in the existence of the dark side, but in the way mortals attempt to wield it. To move beyond the traditional interpretation, we must step outside the narrative for a moment and consider something far more familiar. In our own world, emotions such as anger and ambition are not anomalies. They are not foreign intrusions into an otherwise pure state of being. They are deeply interconnected aspects of human behavior. Anger at its core is a response to obstruction, an emotional surge that arises when something stands in the way of our desires, our goals, or our sense of control. Ambition, likewise, is the drive to overcome those obstacles, to assert ourselves, to shape our environment, to impose our will upon reality. These two forces, anger and ambition, are not separate. They reinforce one another. And within the framework of Star Wars, this dynamic is reflected almost perfectly in the philosophy of the Sith. The Sith do not merely seek power. They embody the human drive to impose will, to refuse limitation, to reject passivity, to reshape the world according to their vision. In this sense, the dark side is not an alien corruption imposed upon the individual. It is an amplification of something already present, which leads us to a critical reinterpretation. What if the dark side is not evil, but rather the raw, unfiltered reservoir of force energy, a deeper, more intense layer of the force that exists beyond what finite beings are naturally equipped to handle? From this perspective, the issue is not morality. It is capacity. Finite mortal creatures, no matter how powerful, are inherently limited in how much of the force they can safely channel. The light side, as taught by the Jedi, emphasizes harmony, patience, and balance precisely because it aligns with those limitations. It encourages controlled access. The dark side, by contrast, represents unrestricted access. It is immediate. It is intense. It is overwhelming. And this explains a phenomenon observed repeatedly throughout the saga. Why beginners, those with little training or discipline, often find it easier to perform certain feats when they are angry. Acts such as telekinetically choking an opponent or violently moving objects do not require refined control. They require output. And anger provides exactly that. It acts as a catalyst, temporarily overriding hesitation, fear, and restraint. In doing so, it allows the individual to tap into deeper reserves of energy, but without the structure necessary to regulate it. The result is power, but power without balance. This is why an untrained force-sensitive might struggle to lift an object calmly, yet succeed in doing so under emotional stress. It is not that anger grants new abilities, it simply removes the barriers that normally regulate access. But in removing those barriers, it also removes control. And this is where the danger lies. Not in the dark side itself, but in the mismatch between infinite energy and finite capacity. Because when a mortal being repeatedly accesses this deeper reservoir without discipline, without balance, and without limitation, the consequences become inevitable. Dependence, distortion, corruption, not as a moral failing, but as a structural consequence of overexposure. Thus, the Sith are not evil simply because they use the dark side. They are dangerous because they attempt to forcefully access and sustain a level of power that exceeds what they are capable of containing. And in doing so, they do not merely wield the Force. They begin to break themselves against it. This interpretation finds further support in a striking admission from Darth Plagueis himself. In the Darth Plagueis novel, the dark side is not described in purely triumphant or glorified terms. Instead, it is likened to an illness, a condition that alters, consumes, and reshapes the individual who embraces it. At first glance, this may appear contradictory. Why would a Sith willingly embrace something described as a sickness? But within the framework we have established, the answer becomes clear. The illness is not evil in a moral sense. It is the side effect of overexposure, a consequence of repeatedly accessing a level of force energy that exceeds the natural limits of a finite being. The more one draws upon this deeper, unrestrained reservoir, the more one's body, mind, and identity begin to adapt, often in destructive ways. Physical degradation, emotional instability, an insatiable hunger for greater power. These are not arbitrary punishments. They are symptoms, and like many forms of power in both fiction and reality, the cost does not deter those who benefit from it. For the Sith, the trade-off is acceptable. They gain immediate strength. They gain dominance. They gain the ability to impose their will upon others and the galaxy itself. To them, the illness is not a flaw to be corrected, it is a necessary transformation. A price willingly paid. This aligns perfectly with the idea that the dark side itself is not inherently malevolent, but rather too potent for mortal beings to engage with safely over extended periods of time. Plagueis does not reject the dark side because it corrupts. He embraces it because it empowers, despite the corruption. And this distinction is crucial. It suggests that what we perceive as evil is not embedded within the dark side itself, but emerges from the imbalanced relationship between the user and the power they seek to control. The Sith do not fall because the dark side forces them to. They fall because they choose to endure the consequences of wielding something far beyond their natural capacity. And in doing so, they become increasingly defined not by balance, but by excess. This brings us to one of the most pivotal figures in Sith history, Darth Sidious. Unlike many Sith before him, Sidious did not merely indulge in the dark side, he studied it, refined it, and arguably came closer than most to understanding its true nature. He recognized that the dark side was not simply a moral deviation or a forbidden path. It was power in its most immediate and unrestrained form. A deeper layer of the Force, raw, potent, and largely inaccessible, without abandoning the limitations that the Jedi so carefully uphold. In this sense, Sidious may be seen as one of the first Sith Lords to grasp a crucial truth: that the dark side is not separate from the Force, but rather an intensified expression of it, an unfiltered reservoir. However, it is here that his interpretation diverges and ultimately falters. Because while Sidious correctly identifies the power inherent in the dark side, he fundamentally misunderstands, or perhaps deliberately rejects, the purpose behind the Jedi's restraint. To him, the light side is weakness. Why? Because the Jedi do not dominate the Force. They do not impose their will upon it. Instead, they yield. They listen. They align. They allow themselves to be guided by the will of the Force rather than seeking to control it. From Sidious's perspective, this appears as passivity, as limitation, as an unnecessary surrender of potential power. But in reality, it is something else entirely. It is discipline. The Jedi recognize a truth that Sidious, despite his insight, chooses to ignore. That finite beings are not meant to wield the totality of the Force. That there is a natural boundary, one that cannot be crossed without consequence. Thus, their restraint is not born of weakness, but of understanding. They do not access the full depth of the Force, not because they cannot, but because doing so would require abandoning balance in favor of excess. Sidious, on the other hand, rejects this limitation. He seeks to override it, to take what is not meant to be fully taken. And in doing so, he exemplifies the very principle we have been exploring: that the danger of the dark side lies not in its existence, but in the attempt to wield it without restraint. Sidious understands the power of the dark side better than most, but he mislabels the alternative. He sees balance as weakness, when in truth it is sustainability. And when this misunderstanding is taken to its absolute extreme, the result is no longer power. It is collapse. Because the further one attempts to push beyond the natural limits of a finite existence, the more the cost begins to outweigh the gain, until the individual is no longer in control of the power they sought to command. This is where figures such as Darth Nihilus and Darth Vitiate become essential to the discussion. They are not simply powerful Sith. They are endpoints, warnings, proof of what happens when the pursuit of limitless force energy is taken beyond all restraint. Nihilus in particular represents the complete inversion of what it means to be a force user. He does not wield the force, he is consumed by the need to feed upon it. His identity erodes, his physical form becomes secondary, and his existence is reduced to an endless hunger. He is no longer a being who uses power. He is a being defined by it. Similarly, Vitiate achieves something that, at first glance, appears to be the ultimate success of Sith ambition: immortality, dominion, and the ability to consume entire worlds. And yet even here the cost is evident. His existence becomes fragmented. His reliance on external energy becomes constant. His connection to the Force is no longer balanced, it is parasitic. These are not triumphs. They are transformations born from excess. They demonstrate that when a finite being attempts to access what is effectively an infinite reservoir, the result is not mastery. It is dependency, and eventually loss of self. Thus, when we revisit the original question, is the dark side inherently evil? The answer becomes far more nuanced. The dark side in its essence may not be evil at all. It may simply be the raw, unfiltered depth of the Force, a level of power that exists beyond what mortal beings are designed to safely access. What we perceive as evil is not the energy itself, but the consequences of attempting to wield it without limitation. The Sith do not fall because the dark side corrupts them in a moral sense. They fall because they push beyond their capacity, forcing a connection that cannot be sustained without distortion. In contrast, the Jedi, through restraint, discipline, and alignment with the will of the Force, avoid this collapse, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand the importance of balance over excess. And in that sense, the true divide between light and dark is not one of good versus evil, but of harmony versus overreach, control versus surrender. Finite beings confronting an infinite power. If you found this perspective thought-provoking, consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. And let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Is the dark side truly evil? Or is it simply a power that no mortal was ever meant to fully wield? Until next time, stay curious, and may the Force guide your understanding.